Do you remember the aftermath of September 11? It was a time of crisis for the aviation industry. Airlines were declaring bankruptcy left and right, and countless pilots were being laid off. Unfortunately, I found myself entering the market as a new professional pilot during this difficult period. The majority of the pilots I knew were struggling to find work, burdened by debt, and willing to do almost anything to earn a paycheck. Some unscrupulous individuals saw this as an opportunity to exploit pilots, treating them as nothing more than slaves. Eventually, I received a call offering me a job. The very next day, I embarked on a 400-mile journey to my new employer, leaving my girlfriend behind. The job paid a mere $15 per flight hour, and commercial flights were rare, so I ended up working 80 hours a week without any pay. To add insult to injury, I had to pay $6,000 for training, which involved flying solo while my employer leisurely watched hacked satellite TV. He insisted that I log those flight hours in my logbook, with him falsely claiming to be the pilot in command. My accommodations consisted of a small, unfurnished room with only an inflatable mattress. Right next to me was a room full of telemarketers. My boss, Mark, was a wealthy man who owned a small aviation school and several apartment buildings. He would often flaunt his money at bars and restaurants, impressing those around him. One day, Mark decided to start a new airline in the Dominican Republic. He purchased a dilapidated airplane for $55,000 that seemed fit for the scrapyard. With just a few hours of training, we were expected to fly it. Our international flight plan to the DR was filed without much attention to aviation safety. We frequently found ourselves in dangerous situations, such as running out of fuel over shark-infested waters or experiencing tire explosions on landing due to Marx's reluctance to invest in proper maintenance. However, despite the constant challenges, we, as young and skilled pilots, managed to overcome the obstacles Mark placed in our path. We walked the fine line between legal and illegal, between safety and danger. Our airplane was in terrible condition, with new issues arising every week that we couldn't repair. In the Dominican Republic, I encountered situations that threatened my safety, including facing guns, attack dogs, organized crime, and dealing with an unstable investor who was promptly jailed. Poverty and hunger were daily companions, as I struggled to survive on a meager monthly salary that barely covered my expenses. It became apparent that Mark couldn't even afford to pay us properly. The realization hit me that I had placed myself and my girlfriend in an awful situation, all for the sake of pursuing a career as a pilot. I was essentially a slave. On that day, my passion for aviation died in my heart. I made the decision to end this nightmare and demanded a return ticket, the only wise clause I had included in my contract. It took some effort to scare Mark into complying, but eventually I managed to escape quickly and return home. This decision completely destroyed his investment in the Dominican Republic, highlighting his poor business acumen by relying solely on one person. Upon returning to my home country, I refused to let him do the same thing to other pilots. I decided to sue him for the $6,000 I had paid for training. Instead of attempting to defend himself, he failed to show up in court. I emerged victorious in my case. However, upon reaching my car after the court hearing, I discovered it had been vandalized from front to rear. Mark, desperate and struggling financially, asked me to ease the pressure regarding the $6,000 he owed me. Against his expectation, I did the opposite. As soon as I legally could, I ordered the seizure of his airplanes. Faced with immediate consequences, he paid me in full, although it seemed he had to rely on credit cards to do so. I returned to my hometown, never to speak to him again. Fast forward a couple of years, and I learned that he was working as a clerk in a Blockbuster store. How the tables had turned. Recently, I discovered that he lost everything he owned and had filed for bankruptcy. No longer could he flaunt piles of money in bars or treat his employees like animals. And to add to his misfortune, he also experienced divorce. It would be easy to assume that I was solely responsible for his downfall, but the truth is that he had a talent for making terrible decisions. Nonetheless, learning about how his life unraveled provided me with a sense of satisfaction. Years ago, I found myself in a challenging situation. Within the span of a day, I lost both my job and the place I called home. The economic downturn had taken its toll, leading to the foreclosure of the residence I shared with a couple of friends. With a mere 2 weeks to find a new living arrangement, I ended up homeless, spending the next 2 years living in my car. It was a difficult period in my life, one that constantly triggered my survival instincts. Living in a bustling city inside a vehicle pushed me into a perpetual state of alertness. The fear and caution never left me, and whenever a potential threat arose, my mind immediately focused on finding the most efficient and effective way to neutralize it. Even now, years later, when I've achieved stability, I find it challenging to assess an appropriate response to a threat. Perhaps that's why I may have gone overboard in the following story. Nonetheless, I'll share it with you, allowing you to form your own opinions and judgments. During my time living in my car, I developed a relationship with someone who had more stability in their life. Surprisingly, she didn't mind my living situation as I always presented myself well and managed to secure temporary work. Unless I disclosed my circumstances, no one would have known I was homeless. At the time, I believed she was genuinely a good person, someone who valued helping others. However, as time passed, we had a falling out and gradually lost contact. Despite the separation, we remained friends on Facebook. She had a considerable number of friends on the platform, around 500, which becomes relevant later in the story. About a year after our breakup and 6 months after our last meaningful conversation, things were looking up for me. I had recently started a new job and was about to undergo training. This opportunity meant that I would finally be able to leave behind my life in the car and transition into a more permanent residence. I had worked hard to reach this point, and everything seemed great. I found myself at a Kinko's, using their internet on my laptop when my phone rang. It was her. After a brief exchange of pleasantries, she got straight to the point. Her partner had gotten her pregnant and then abandoned her. She needed someone to accompany her to the abortion clinic, but since she was considered the epitome of perfection among her circle of friends and family, she couldn't bring herself to ask any of them for help. Instead, she reached out to me. Part of me felt unsettled that after such a long period of silence, this was the only reason she felt compelled to contact me. On the other hand, I always strive to be a good person, even if it sometimes backfired. That's how I was raised. However, in this particular situation, I genuinely couldn't assist her. The next day, I was supposed to drop off my car at a friend's house and catch a bus to another state for my job orientation. Even if I wanted to help, which I didn't particularly want to, it would have been impossible. I explained this to her, and that's when everything fell apart. She began screaming at me over the phone, acting hysterical, crying, and hurling insults. The scene I unintentionally created attracted attention from the people nearby, who stared at me as her voice filled the room. Struggling to maintain my composure, I told her I had to end the call and asked her to message me instead. Some of you might anticipate where this story is heading and assume I acted poorly, but I ask that you reserve judgment until the end. I promise it'll be worth it. Soon after, insults started flooding my Facebook chat. I realized that if I mishandled this situation, it could come back to haunt me. I started steering the conversation, prodding her for more details, and she unwittingly played along. I confirmed her pregnancy in the chat, as well as the fact that her partner had abandoned her. I questioned why he had left, as I had believed they were close. I informed her, once again, that I couldn't help due to my imminent bus trip the next morning. Up to this point, I was willing to wish her luck and move on, as my life was about to take a significant turn. However, she dropped a bombshell on me. If you don't help me, I'm going to tell everyone that it's your child and that you're abandoning me because you don't want to take responsibility. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. And then it hit me. She said it over Facebook chat. Instead of warning her or telling her to leave me alone, I found myself contemplating the consequences of a false accusation on the eve of my life-changing journey. It was in that moment, fueled by the survival instincts that had become ingrained in me, that a single thought emerged. I had to protect myself from this witch, and I knew exactly how to do it. I feigned reluctant agreement, telling her, "Fine, I'll help you, but I can't take you to the clinic tomorrow. It will have to be later this week. I'll need to rearrange my plans. Let's talk tomorrow." She agreed. Without wasting any time, I sprang into action. Within minutes, I had forwarded the chat transcript to approximately 100 people on her friends list. I also tagged all of our mutual friends. The chat was shared on her church's and employers' Facebook pages. As an afterthought, I even sent it to her parents. Almost immediately, my phone started buzzing incessantly. I shut off my laptop and phone, retreated to my car, and spent my final night there. I won't attempt to describe the ensuing fallout, as it's likely already playing out in your mind. Lines were drawn, threats were made, people lost their jobs, and death threats were exchanged. Suffice it to say that her reputation was irreparably damaged to the point where she had to delete all her social media accounts and relocate across the country to escape the stigma associated with her small hometown. Was my reaction excessive? Perhaps, but for me, it was a matter of justice. When I was 19, I found myself working for an absolutely awful boss who despised the fact that I had 2 other jobs in addition to the one with him. Despite never missing a shift, he would intentionally make me work late, knowing that I would only get a measly 4 hours of sleep before heading off to school. It was a ploy to make me quit one or both of my other jobs. One day, I showed up for my 4 p.m. shift, and my boss immediately instructed me to take the backhoe down to ABC Business. Apparently, there was a crew of 10 guys waiting to load equipment onto pallets, and it was my responsibility to transport them to the truck. Now, ABC Business was a good 5 miles away, and the backhoe's top speed was a mere 15 miles per hour. I hesitated, pointing out that the route mostly consisted of a 2-lane road, but before I could finish my sentence, my boss rudely cut me off and threatened to fire me if I said another word. Naturally, I was furious. I had no patience for such disrespect, especially considering the paltry $8 per hour wage I was earning. So I embarked on the journey. Around 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed my phone incessantly ringing. With the loud noise of the tractor, I decided to play it off, pretending not to hear the calls, back when people didn't rely on silent mode as much. As I continued on about halfway through the trip, it dawned on me that my boss was probably referring to ABC Business's old location, which had shut down 6 months prior. Surprisingly, it was only about a mile away from our starting point, not the 5-mile distance he had initially mentioned. With this realization, I completed the remainder of the drive and eventually dialed my boss's number, calmly informing him that the location was empty and no one had shown up. Though he had intended for me to go to the old location, he suspected my mistake. However, he attributed it to the incompetence of a 19-year-old kid and let everyone else go home with 2 hours of pay. The rage in his eyes was unmistakable, but he couldn't reprimand me for being foolish. Instead, I was granted the rest of the night off after enduring a long drive home, constantly pulling over to let other vehicles pass on the highway. Sometimes, life presents us with small victories, and even now, 12 years later, I relish in the memory of this particular triumph.